Hear words of faith from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 19, verses 28 to 40. After Jesus had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. When he had come near Bethphage and Bethany at a place called the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of the disciples, saying, "Go into the village ahead of you, and as you enter, if you will find tied there a colt that has never been ridden, untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' just say this, 'The rabbi needs it.'" So those who were sent departed and found it as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners asked them, "Why are you untying the colt?" They said, "The rabbi needs it." Then they brought it to Jesus, and after throwing their cloaks on the colt, they set Jesus on it. As he rode along, people kept spreading their cloaks on the road. As he was now approaching the path down from the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all the deeds of power that they had seen, saying, "Blessed is the ruler who comes in God's name. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven." Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, order your disciples to stop." He answered, "I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would shout out." For the stories of Jesus making God known to us, we give thanks. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. That's better, I can see you a little better. I look forward to the culture of the place, to learning about your culture, and look forward to our time together, hopefully to move into your new future together. Liberation is a journey. The events of Palm Sunday occur in the beginning of Passover week, when many Jewish pilgrims gathered in Jerusalem from across the world to remember their ancestors who were slaves in Egypt, when the ancestors, the ancient Israelites, cried out for liberation and freedom. The Passover was an opportunity to recollect how Moses led them from Egypt into a new land, into a new life, and how Yahweh, their God, accompanied them. In the first century, the story of liberation, the time of Jesus, the time of the gospel writer, this story of liberation was a story of hope, faith, and courage for Jewish people, who again, over those many thousands of years, again hoped for new freedom from the tyranny of harshness, of the colonisation and domination of Rome. So in our Palm Sunday story, Marcus Borg and John Crossan inform us that there were two processions moving towards Jerusalem. It was the beginning of the week of Passover, the most sacred week of the Jewish year. So one was a peasant procession, the other was an imperial procession. From the east, Jesus rode a donkey down the Mount of Olives. Jesus never entered Jerusalem, by the way. On the opposite side of the city, from the west, Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, entered Jerusalem. At the head of a column of imperial cavalry and soldiers, Pilate's military procession was a demonstration maybe like Trump's tariffs, demonstration of power. Pilate's military procession was a demonstration of both Roman imperial power and Roman imperial theology. Now, with the Lucan reading, while the Lucan reading has only the followers of Jesus giving grateful voice to the liberating ministry of Jesus, the other Gospels, all the other Gospels, and I want to sort of tilt a little bit to the other Gospels, all the other Gospel writers note that the crowd shouted, "Hosanna," which in Aramaic meant, "Save us, we pray." Equally, we could say, "Liberate us. We seek liberation." And this in oppression. The people cried out for liberation. And the people still today, particularly in our very difficult times, cry out for liberation today. So I want to pause and enter a bit of my own history, because in a sense you need to know a bit about me, don't you, Des? We already know stuff about each other, but let's get a bit deeper. And it will be deep. And I want to sort of, spoiler alert, Russian, Ukrainian, Australian. What do you know about the temperament of Ukrainians and Russians, apart from the fact we like vodka, Des? We're direct. I might cry. Do Filipino, Malaysian people cry? Are men allowed to cry? Are we allowed to cry? We are. But certainly I'm serious that this may shed a tear. And if I do, I do. So what does liberation mean? The promise of the liberation of Europe at the end of World War II was short-lived. My Ukrainian mother emerged in Salzburg in Austria from the dust of war and was fortunate to be in the American sector. Cities and nations in the war regions of Europe were carved up into 4 areas: the British, the French, the Americans and Soviets, carved up by 4. Every Soviet person, like my mother, who was in a Russian sector, was sent back as a traitor and was sent to gulags, even Stalin's granddaughter. My mother's life story is a historical example of the fluidity and contradiction, the contradictory nature of freedom and liberation, especially of oppressed and colonised people, and those of us who are marginalised, excluded, and abjected. The Soviet dream of freedom and liberty for all began with great ambitions, if you know your history. Lionel gave me a good book on Stalin, so I'm grateful to Lionel. It began with great ambitions similar to the revolutionaries in France, who made liberté, égalité, fraternité the core words: freedom, equality, solidarity, belonging. Both dreams, the Soviet, French Revolution, were short-lived. But to achieve freedom and liberty, those in power in the Soviet Union decided that force was the way to change society, to recolonise, to standardise society, the culture, the economy, and the inner mind. And oppression crushes us and forms and shapes us. Before my mother was born in the 1920s, her father, who was Jewish, was sent to a gulag. In 1933-34, if you know your Ukrainian history, there was the Great Famine in Ukraine, caused by the Soviet economic policy. Millions died unnecessarily. And my mother watched her mother die. All her siblings died. And at the age of 8 and 9, she was an orphan. Never told us much about that story. Did a neighbour say, "Come and I'll look after you"? Did the local institution say, "Here's an orphanage, become one of us"? When the Nazis occupied all of Ukraine by November of 1941, they realised that they needed to find workers to replace the 3 million soldiers who were now fighting in the Soviet Union. So what does a good country do that's economic and has good plans? They deported young people back to replace the 3 million soldiers. My mother was a teenager. They used to close off streets in Kiev and take young people, put them in trains in a long journey, and they'd end up somewhere. Germany, Austria. And it's estimated between 10 and 13 million workers, labourers, were taken, mostly women and young people. Throughout her life, my mother shared very, very little of this colonising, traumatic experience. So when she emerged in Salzburg at the end of World War II, tainted, marked by war, labour, she was one of those who survived a range of brutal and traumatic historical experiences. Now, in Salzburg, our history is so limited from the family side. She was a displaced person. And now she was finally liberated. At this point of liberation, the process of liberation, she was liberated from being a forced labourer, wasn't she? But the fluctuations and contradictions of liberation were to persist for most of her life. While waiting to find a host nation, and a lot of refugees in that time, displaced persons, waited 4 or 5 years. Of course, a lot of Jewish people waited until they had a land. And we're partly Jewish, my family. While waiting for a host nation, she found herself trapped in a loveless relationship with my father. In Australia, when they arrived as a poor migrant family, we then lived in domestic violence and faced the racism here in Australia, and I don't blame anybody here, please, of the 50s and the 60s. Don't speak your language. What a strange name. I used to sit up the back of the class, Des, because they'd ask my name and how do you say this name? And you said it very well, by the way. It was good. I liked it. Not everybody can. Liberation means developing a capacity for reflection and meaning. Brutal and historical experiences involve social, cultural, economic, political, psychic inner life, and spiritual dimensions. And they can impede us from fully experiencing life, fully experiencing the divine presence, fully experiencing ourselves, because I don't know who I am. I've been made somewhere else. They can create an alienated identity and meaning system. We can be alienated from ourselves, our body, our feelings, others, and our mind. Frantz Fanon, or if you like in English, Frantz Fanon, a French West Indian psychiatrist and political philosopher who supported the Algerian War, this was in the 60s, the Algerian War of Independence from France, offers insights into the debilitating alienation of colonisation. A black man, he says black man, so I have to say he says black man, so sorry if you understand what I'm man, right? Observing the effects and affects of colonisation of himself and his people, Fanon writes, "The black man is not a man." In the colonial logic, the colonised cannot create their own meaning. The colonial values deny the black man, he writes, not just individuality, but also humanity. Howard McGarry explains, alienation particular to particular to oppression is self-alienation. And not just alienation from work and life, but from a positive sense of self. Kelly Oliver, in a book that's really moved me, The Colonisation of Psychic Space, further notes oppression, especially racist and sexist oppression, denigrates and abjects people in an attempt to deny a positive self. It is not just that the sense of self is distorted from human to animal to base pleasures, but the sense of self is abjected as bad, as evil, contaminated. In the few years before the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Nazi regime were quite systematic about most things, sadly, and they prepared their soldiers for the encounter with the Soviet people. They created perverse propaganda about the inferior and debased nature of Soviet people. We were from the East, of course, weren't we? That was to build the capacity of soldiers to see them as enemies, to kill them, yes, and exterminate them. There was even a plan to sterilise women and allow the Soviet peoples to die out. This is our humanity. And in different ways, it still goes on. So this was an attempt to abject a whole people as contaminated, base, like animals. And so Kelly Oliver importantly notes the struggle to liberate psychic space from colonisation, from abjection, hinges on the ability of the colonised to make meaning for oneself. And this liberation process, for some of us, can take a lifetime. I observed that there was always a deep spiritual desire that stirred my mother. Not time to cry, right? Even in the most difficult times at home, for all of us. The world for her was not a safe place, but she sensed the presence of God in her life because she had read that this God suffered like she suffered, and the world did not understand Jesus. And so she saw a brother in time in its journey. She sought out various religious groups. I mean, the Jehovah's Witnesses knocked on the door and a whole range of people. She looked and she looked. But in the end, and while it was a bit crazy, she developed her own monastic experience. It was amazing. She developed her own experience. We were very poor in Adelaide. We lived in a market garden, so you'd have to rise at 4 a.m. to beat the morning sun to get the tomatoes out of the glass houses before you cooked and they cooked. So she would wake at 3 a.m. and read the scriptures and pray every day. So over time, through the stories of the Hebrew scriptures, she loved the Psalms, the stories of Jesus. She was able to remake her own meaning and fashion a new self, not in the way that some of us, because some of us I know read very deeply in this stuff, but in her own, she made it up. But she remade herself. She created her own theology because she was a literalist, and as I grew to be a bit of a theologian, I guess, we had many theological and cultural differences, but it worked for her. The liberation of the story of Jesus. Mari Ruti has been a key influence in my life. She sadly passed just a few years ago from breast cancer in her 50s. She was a teacher of critical theory, psychoanalysis, and gender and queer theory. In her book, Reinventing the Soul, Posthumanist Theory and Psychic Life, she notes that our social symbolic world can be composed of stories and truths that are harmful fictions. She'd worked on deconstructive efforts to expose stories that maintain fixed and wounding conventions, not only of gender and sexuality, but also of class, of race, of ethnicity. And she follows Friedrich Nietzsche and Roland Barthes not only to deconstruct harmful stories, but to create new stories that possess the power to shape our realities, with the potential to radically restructure not just our inner lives, but our lives together, our life in the world. For us, for me, this is the story of Jesus. But there are some who use the story of Jesus against us, and it's never the case in the story of Jesus. Now, last week, Jolyon stood in for me. I guess you had the John 11 and John 12 readings last week. Is that right? Okay. So those of you who were here last week. And for somebody who wants to do a PhD on this, the more I sat with this, and I won't go into it, it's a lot, and I'm carrying on a bit, aren't I? But last week's reading in John 11 and 12, critically interpreted, offers a powerful image of liberty, freedom, equality, solidarity and belonging. The family of Mary, Martha and Lazarus are symbolic of being a new people of the divine presence on the way to the cross and the resurrection. A social space, a cultural space where there is death in life. Lazarus has died. All are impacted. Mary and Martha and the community around them, not just Mary and Martha, the community around them, the text says, they all grieve. They express their sadness. And in solidarity with them, Jesus arrives, is deeply moved in body and being, grieves and supports. Jesus in prayer alerts the community that they live in a greater reality, one that is aware of death in life, participating with us in our realities, the divine presence. As Richard Rohr writes in Everything Belongs, that we live in presence and are invited to live in awareness of this presence and in the power of this presence. And then in John 12, as Jesus is aware of his own death in life, Mary represents our moving in solidarity with Jesus as she pours oil on his feet. We are with you, Jesus. We, like Mary, are invited to live in solidarity with the divine life, in genuine compassion, collaboration, seeking life in death. And I know some of you, some of us really well. We've all experienced death in life, but equally we have found life in death. And before I conclude, and maybe I will cry in the conclusion, in John 15:15, this is my go-to. Jesus creates a new metaphor. You are no longer my servants, my slaves, and that's about a colonial thing. You are my friends. And as friends, we have equality and belonging. Like my mother, who made crazy theology up, we can make up theology, and that's okay. My conclusion. When I was 19, I left home, Adelaide, and went to theological college in Sydney. A bit young, really. I was a youth worker, street worker. My mother, sister and brother and their little dog walked out of our poor fibro house, left my father and moved into her new home. One day when she was in her 70s, I stood next to her in the kitchen of her own house, her own life, and we looked out over her garden, which she's magic. It was just alive. Large back garden in Adelaide. Chickens, she had names for them all. And the sunshine. And she said, "Oi, Vova, kak chudno." Vova is an endeared name for, Vladimir. In other words, in English, "Oh, Vova," she said with such elation, "how wonderful life is." As I looked at her overjoyed face, I could sense that in her later life, or through her life, she had finally found freedom, liberation, forgiveness, and a softness that wasn't always there. Hers was a journey full of contradictions, as you've heard, of one liberation after another, a challenge after another. But she finally found her peace and contentment, her liberation. In her liberation was our liberation. And can I say to each of you, it's your liberation that we walk together as equals, belonging, loved, and that we have the potentiality to change our mind, our community, and to address the incredible imbalances in the world today.